Now we're recording. AA Beyond Belief is a podcast by, for, and about people who have found a secular path to sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is John. I'm your host, and today I have a guest who's beaming in all the way from Thailand, originally from London, but living in Thailand. We'll find out why and how that happened later on. But let's start by just introducing you to this fella. His name is Andy F., and he is joining me right now on AA Beyond Belief. Welcome to the podcast, Andy. How you doing?
Thanks very much, John. My name is Andy, and I am an alcoholic, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's nice to see you. I was glad to get your email. You know, it took me a few days to get to read your story, but it was an interesting story. And though we had different events happen in our lives, there was a lot in your story that I could personally relate to. So I thought what might be a good idea is to kind of go through your early life, your story, to what brought you to the place where you thought that you might like to write a book, which you're writing now. And that book is titled, what is it?
The 12 Steps for
12
Agnostics.
Steps for Agnostics. Yeah. So let's begin with your story. Let's start with your, if you don't mind, into your early life and into your addiction and when you got into AA and the challenges you had from there on.
Of course. Okay, well, I was born in London in 1954 to a Polish mother who was a war refugee. She came to the UK from Italy with the Polish army that fought the Germans there. And she became naturalized in the UK and soon after became a British citizen. I never knew my dad. I never had a dad. So she was a single mum raising me. And she wasn't able to actually take care of me when I was little because in those days in England, there were no welfare benefits for single mothers. Yeah. So she put me into foster care. And I went into foster care with this Polish lady who took in kids that weren't her own. She was paid for doing this job. And she was like a professional foster mother, if you like. Yeah. And so I went there when I was 18 months old. And of course, I don't remember very much at that time. But as I started to grow up, I began to realize that the affection that she had for my foster brother was much deeper than how she felt about me. Yeah, she actually she gave me the care that I needed, but in a very cold and indifferent way. Yeah, so I grew up feeling rejected basically as a child, and that my foster brother was getting all the love and all the affection. And I started to feel really angry about that. When I was old enough to know what was going on, I was also very angry that my mother put me into care in the first place. And I took that as an abandonment. And so already at a fairly early age, I had quite severe identity issues and self-esteem issues from as far back as I can remember. And what was interesting was that this foster mother was a very ardent church-going Christian. Yeah. So we had to go to church every Sunday, and there was quite a rigid Catholic regimen in the foster family that I grew up with. And I began to wonder what on earth was this woman going to church for, yeah, and talking about God, yeah, and talking about love, the love of Jesus and all the rest of it, when she was treating me so badly, yeah. I don't say this as a victim because I've dealt with those issues by going through the steps, but the reality of it was that she was a bully, she was emotionally abusive, she put me down a lot, yeah. She constantly compared me to my foster brother, who I suppose you could say was the family hero. Yeah. And so I grew up with a lot of confusion about God. It has to be said that by the time I was 9 or 10 years old and I started to gain a little bit of self-awareness, I also had a very kind of childlike fantasy about God. And I also, the feelings of abandonment that I felt from my mother, I also projected onto my fantasy or my idea of what God was. So my thinking was that if my mother abandoned me, then God had abandoned me too. Because if there was a God, he would never have allowed that to happen to me. So already I had resentments or reservations about the whole idea of God. And then when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my mother sent me to a Roman Catholic Polish boarding school outside London, run by an order of Polish priests. And the religious regimen there was very austere as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we had to attend Mass every morning and benediction every evening. And 3 times a day, we would have to recite a prayer called the Angelus, yeah, before meal times. And we were punished for non-attendance or for disregard or not showing up at Mass, yeah. So by the time I was 13 years old, I had a massive chip on my shoulder about the way that I was treated by my foster mother. I was very angry that my mother had abandoned me and put me into care because I took it as abandonment. I didn't understand that she had to work to support herself and me because she was paying this woman. And so I became a very angry and bitter young man at the age of 15 or 16. And while all this was going on, my mother became an active alcoholic as well, on top of that. Yeah. And she met a guy who was a Polish doctor, and he was a fairly violent and abusive alcoholic. And she started to drink with him. And so whenever I was home on holidays, I would come home to a mother that was completely inebriated. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
And
I think you also said that, I believe that, so you were 9 years old when she took you out of foster care. Is that right?
yes,
And you
yes.
didn't, did you not have any contact with your mother until that time?
I went home for oh, no, that's
Okay.
not true. That's not true.
Okay.
She did come and visit me and take me out for the day
Oh, okay.
uh, when I was with my foster mother.
I
Yeah.
see.
Um,
So you did
and
have you had that relate, you knew of your mother then. Okay. I was wondering about that when I read your story. Okay.
yeah, I did have a connection. She always loved me, my mum, but circumstances were such that
Sure.
she couldn't take care of me. Yeah.
Right.
And it was the same when I went to boarding school. I would come home, not to my foster mother anymore, but to my biological mother. I
Gotcha.
would come home for holidays. Yeah. And this is when, by this time, my mother was a daily drinker. Yeah. So I would come home and more or less the whole weekend that I was there, there was very little connection between me and my mother because she was drunk.
Sure.
So as you can imagine, I was a sensitive child. And as you can imagine, I took all of this very badly. Yeah. And I took example from my mother. And as soon as I was able, I picked up my first drink at the age of 13. And my very first drink, I was an alcoholic from the moment that I picked up my first drink. Yeah. I wanted to get as out of my head as possible so that I didn't have to feel the pain and the confusion and the rage that I felt both towards my mother for abandoning me, to God that I absolutely hated if it even did exist. Yeah.
Right.
uh, and um, and to my foster mother. And I became an alcoholic. And I have to be honest and say that I didn't only have alcoholism when I was a teenager. I developed, as a result of my experiences, my childhood experiences, I developed quite severe personality disturbances. Yeah. And by the time I was 15 years old, my mother took me to see a psychiatrist, and I was removed from school. And at 15, I was placed in a psychiatric institution, yeah, where I spent the next 3 years, yeah. All the time, every moment that I could get, I drank and I took drugs, yeah. To me, life had dealt me a very bad hand, and I wanted to drown my misery and my pain and my unhappiness with alcohol and drugs. And I became a full-on alcoholic and addict. I spent 3 years in that hospital, and I had other hospitalizations in other hospitals in the meantime. But in the end, I went back to my original hospital, and one day they decided to discharge me after this long period of being in hospital. And I was sent home because I refused to comply with their treatment program. Yeah, I was a rebel. I was a born rebel. So I went home to my mother, and my mother had by this time met someone and was in a relationship with someone. And I guess, in all honesty, I was such a mess as a drunk and as an addict that she wouldn't accept me at home. And I had to take to the streets. Yeah. And I lived on the streets for quite a long time, and eventually ended up in prison. And I spent a little while in prison. I was actually planted up with drugs by the police. I don't know if you know that expression, but they were clearing up the neighborhood that I was in from alcoholics and addicts, and they put drugs on my person, arrested me. Yeah, they actually planted drugs on me, and I was arrested and sent to prison. And so I'm not going to go into the whole details of my using, but by the time I was 23, I found what in AA is described as the geographical cure. Yeah. And I got an opportunity to go to Israel to work on a kibbutz in Israel. Okay. Yeah. My mother paid for the flight because in London she was afraid that I would kill myself drinking and drugging. Yeah. So I got sent out to Israel to work on a kibbutz. And of course, there was no access to drugs there. So I just took to the bottle. Now, in Israel at the time, it was something like $1 or $2 for a bottle of vodka. Yeah. So I drank to my heart's content. I stayed in Israel for 2 years, and eventually had to come back to the UK. And as soon as I got back, I started using again. Yeah. And it carried on like that. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but it carried on like that until I was 30. When I was 30, I found myself on another geographical cure in Norway. I went to Norway to visit a girl that I met on the kibbutz, and I fell head over heels in love with this girl. And I met her on the kibbutz, and that was an unrequited relationship. So I went to Norway, and I met this other girl there in Norway that I ended up marrying. Yeah. And we came back to London, and as soon as we came back to London, I started to go to meetings. Okay. I was 30 years old when I went to my first meeting, and I started to go to meetings. And I loved the fellowship. I loved AA, and I went to the other fellowship as well. I absolutely loved the meetings because for the first time in my life, I had a sense that I belonged somewhere. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I had a sense of connection. All my life, I felt like an alien from another planet in this world. Yeah. And I went to my first meeting, and people were talking about how I felt all my life, basically. Yeah. And it was a homecoming for me. Coming to the fellowship was an homecoming, and I loved the fellowship from my first meeting. And it took a while for the fog to clear, for the alcoholic fog to clear, and I was completely off my head when I came to the fellowship with that kind of history and that kind of drinking. But eventually the fog cleared, and I began to look around the rooms and see what was going on in the meetings. And I noticed that people had sponsors, and they were all working the steps. Yeah. And I looked at the steps on the scrolls on the wall, and I came to steps 2 and 3. And at that moment, I have to say that my heart sank. Yeah. And I thought, oh my God. Yeah. What on earth has God or a higher power got to do with not drinking and drugging? Yeah. I couldn't see the connection. And I began to suspect that perhaps the fellowship wasn't the right place for me after all. Yeah. When I saw steps 2 and 3. At the time, to me, a higher power meant the same thing as God. To me, they were the same. To me, they were the same thing. So steps 2 and 3 were impossible for me to take. And so I decided not to bother getting a sponsor or doing the steps. And I decided to try and deal with my issues, which I had many, yeah, by going into psychotherapy, yeah. So I was going to meetings, and I embarked on a 10-year journey of trying to resolve my early trauma or issues by going into analytical psychotherapy. Now, psychotherapy or therapy works for a lot of alcoholics and a lot of addicts, yeah? But in all honesty, it didn't work for me. And I couldn't understand why I was doing all this therapy and I was feeling even more angry and even more bitter about the things that happened to me as a kid, with the abandonment and with the emotional neglect that I suffered with my foster mother. And I kept on relapsing. I was going to therapy, and I used to come out of therapy so full of rage and bitterness, even talking about my childhood, yeah, that I would go home and I would drink or use, yeah. It just got worse and worse. And it got to the stage, I was going to meetings all the time. I never stopped going to meetings, but I was getting mentally and emotionally, I was getting sicker instead of better. And I couldn't understand why therapy wasn't working for me. Yeah. I found out much, much later when I was doing the steps with a sponsor that what I was actually using on drinking on was something that he told me he called the victim belief system. Yeah. I had a very, very strong victim belief system, and it wasn't helping me to think like that or to have that belief. Yeah. So I was I was 13 years in AA, and I was sitting, of all places, in a step 1 meeting where they did the step 1 every week on a Sunday in London. And I was listening to the first step read out of the 12 and 12. Who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one. Glass in hand, we have warped our minds into such an obsession for destructive drinking that only an act of providence could remove it from us. So here I was, 13 years in, counting days again, yeah, in a situation of absolute hopelessness and despair. And something happened to me in that meeting, which, although it was very painful, John, yeah, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And the way that I understand it today was that my ego collapsed in that meeting. I knew that I was absolutely done, that my way wasn't working, yeah, that my very best thinking would always end up with a drink or a drug in my hands, yeah. And I didn't know what else to do. I kind of had a sense that my number was up, and that if I didn't do something very radical about myself, I was going to die. And that became a very clear reality. It was a very sobering moment
Sure.
for me to realize that if I carried on like this, it was going to all be over for me very soon. And I ended up going to these meetings in Chelsea, these AA meetings, which I knew had a reputation of having very tough sponsorship. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd met the guy that started these meetings. His name was David B. And he's a fairly well-known, charismatic figure in the London Fellowship.
I think I've heard of him. I've heard another guest talk about him before.
Yeah, and I asked him for sponsorship. Yeah.
Okay.
David B. Started a cluster of groups in the London Fellowship known as the Vision for You. Yeah,
Okay.
groups. And they were known in London. They were a cult, in fact. Yeah, they were an AA cult, and they worked on a very, very strict sponsorship ethic. Yeah, where you didn't do anything without your sponsor's permission. Yeah,
Okay.
so I was so desperate. I had, I suppose, what you would call the gift of desperation. Yeah, which actually is a useful acronym for God, gift of desperation. Yeah. And I had that gift of desperation, and I asked David B to help me. And he said to me, he was a ex-British Army captain. Yeah. From a fairly aristocratic English family, and he ran those Vision for You groups like they were the army. Yeah. And all of his sponsees called him the captain.
Hmm.
And the first thing that he said to me was, "Are you willing to go to any lengths, lad?" Yeah. And I said, "Yes, David, I'm willing to do whatever you say. If you tell me jump, I'll jump. How, I'll just ask how
Mhm.
high." And then he gave me a sticker to put on my shaving mirror, which was a turning point in my recovery. And I had to stick this sticker on my shaving mirror and look at it every morning when I was shaving. And the sticker said, "You are now looking at the problem." Yeah. And to me, that was a massive turning point, because all my life I'd blamed my childhood. I'd blamed the psychiatrists, the social workers. I blamed my foster mother. I blamed my alcoholic mother. It was everyone else's fault that I was an alcoholic and I was destroying my life. And now David was suggesting to me that I was the problem. And at the time, I needed to hear that, yeah, because I was so committed to the victim belief system, John, that I was really going to kill myself with it. Yeah, I had a death wish. I had a horrendous death wish by this time. And so I started to go through the steps. Now, the strange thing is that David B was a practicing Catholic. Yeah. In fact, he used to have this very strange ritual every Sunday morning. Yeah. He had about 30 sponsees, David did. Yeah. And every Sunday morning, all of his sponsees had to go to the Brompton Oratory Catholic Church in London and attend Mass. And he insisted that you do that whether you believed in God or not. Yeah.
Hmm.
So everybody had to wear a suit and show up to Mass every Sunday morning. And I said to him during sponsorship, when he was sponsoring me, I said, "But David, I don't believe in God. To me, it is absolute nonsense." And despite the fact that he was a practicing Catholic, he did something which probably saved my life. Yeah. He guided me to page 27 of the 12 and 12. And there at the bottom of the page, Bill clearly states in the chapter on step 2, you can, if you wish, make AA your higher power. Yeah. And I never heard that before. I never heard that I could actually make AA my higher power. Yeah. And to me, that was the turning point. And I suddenly realized that I had a higher power That was AA. And I began to develop other conceptions of higher powers that were practical, that I could use. And those conceptions were David's suggestions, daily suggestions. I don't want to say that I turned David into my higher power,
Sure.
but I did turn his suggestions into my higher power. Yeah. And the suggestions were a daily program of writing daily gratitude lists, yeah, calling newcomers, getting service commitments, yeah, and all those kind of practical things to help me to get out of myself, yeah, because I was totally self-obsessed and self-centered, yeah. When I got to step 3, I said, David, how am I going to do this step 3? And he said to me, lad, step 3 is just a decision to go on with the rest of the steps.
There you go. That's how I see it.
Just to go on with the rest of the steps.
It's a
Yeah.
decision. That's exactly
It,
right. You know, so many people get hung up on the God part of that step, but the most important part of the step is the decision.
it was a decision, he
It's a
told me,
decision. Mhm.
to go on with the rest of the steps. And he said to me that when you get to step 12, you're not even promised a God awakening. What you're promised is a spiritual
That's a good
awakening.
point.
Yeah. And he said to me that you won't experience that until you complete the first 9 steps. Yeah. You won't even know, what a spiritual awakening means. So don't worry about God. Don't worry about any spiritual awakenings. Just do the steps. And that's exactly what I did. I
There
just
you go.
I became teachable. And God for me at that time was God, which stood for good, orderly direction. Yeah. Which is I found that to be a very useful acronym. Yeah. And I worked through the steps. And when we got to step 8, uh, David had a fairly unusual way of doing step 8. Yeah. He had his sponsees doing it in 3 columns. Yeah. In the first column, you had to write down the person that you had harmed. In the second column, you had to write down the exact nature of the harm that you caused them. And in the third column, you had to write down how you would have felt if the same thing had been done to you.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I did that. And you have to remember that I was completely self-obsessed. I saw myself as a total victim. Yeah. It was all about me. And here I was writing down all the people that I'd harmed. And believe me, there were many. Yeah. But I couldn't see that until I did my 4th and 5th step. Yeah. And I wrote down all the harms that I'd caused them and how I would have felt if I'd have received the same harm. And as I was writing, I suddenly realized that there was tears streaming down my face. Yeah. And those tears suddenly became full on sobbing. Yeah. And I started to sob and cried uncontrollably while I was writing my 8th step. And for me, John, that was a spiritual awakening right there. Because for the first time in my life, I was able to access empathy and compassion for the harms that I'd caused other people. Yeah. And my self-centeredness was neutralized in that moment because I got in touch with the empathy and the compassion that had always been within me, but was buried under the self-centeredness of the disease, yeah, of alcoholism. And I knew in that moment that I could never be the same person again. Yeah, that come what may, I had to try my utmost to become a decent human being. Yeah, because I screwed a lot of people when I was drinking and drugging. There's no question about it. I was a liar, a thief, a cheat, and a manipulator, and a user and abuser of people, all designed to fill the terrible emptiness inside me. Yeah. And from that day forward, I believe that my spiritual awakening began. Yeah. And for me, that was the vital spiritual experience that Carl Jung talked about in chapter 2, when he was working with Roland H. Yeah. It was the entire psychic change that Dr. Silkworth talked about in The Doctor's Opinion.
Right.
I simply became a decent human being, and I was able to feel other people's pain, more importantly, the pain that I had caused them. And ever since then, my journey has been about seeing what I can contribute to people rather than what I can take from people. Yeah. And that has been my journey in AA in steps 10, 11, and 12, is learning how to help others, basically. And I have found tremendous happiness, peace, and freedom by helping others. It overcomes the self-centeredness of the disease. When I'm doing service or when I'm sponsoring someone, guess what? I'm not thinking about me.
Right. How
And when
long
I'm
of a
not
period of time did it take you to go through those steps?
I had to go through them several times, John, if I'm
Okay.
honest.
Okay.
Yeah. There was so much denial. Yeah. And I was so committed to the victim belief system that after I left David, I got a guy from LA called Jamie. Yeah. Who relapsed after 20 years in AA. And he went through the steps again. And he showed me a way of doing step 4 that I'd never seen before. Yeah. Which was the way that Joe and Charlie did step 4 in the 5 columns,
Right.
where in the 5th column you had to answer 5 questions, yeah, beside each resentment that you had. Where was I dishonest? Where was I self-seeking? Where was I frightened? Where was I at fault? Where was my mistake? Yeah, and that helped to kind of dismantle my victim belief system when I began to live in the 5th column of the 4th step. And Jamie helped me with that. Yeah. I came out of very gradually, I came out of the victim belief system, which was killing me. Yeah. And I started to grow up and become an adult, a normal, integrated
Right.
adult. Yeah. And the blame game stopped. Yeah. And I understood that my sobriety, that I would never be cured of alcoholism, I will never be cured of this disease, that indeed, yeah, my recovery was contingent on the maintenance of my spiritual condition, on the daily maintenance of my spiritual
Right.
condition. And
So
so
it's that when you talk about the victim, what do you call it? Um, the
I
victim
call,
mindset. What's it called?
Jamie said to me that he called it the victim belief system.
The victim belief system. So basically, by not by not focusing on the harm that others had done you, and rather on your reaction to whatever events happen in your life, it kind of gave you more of an ability to actually um, learn something about yourself, because you could you can kind of put the harm, like the church, that they weren't, they were abusive, your foster mother, she was abusive, but focusing on that wasn't helpful, so it was
I
more
have no
helpful.
resentments. I have no resentments towards my foster mother. Yeah. My mother died about 10 or 11 years ago, and it was the last 2 years of her life. I was her full-time carer. Yeah. I actually went to live in the family in her apartment and took care of her for the last 2 years. And I treated her appallingly as well. She abandoned me when I was a kid.
Right.
But I actually was violent with my mother. I stole from her. I did terrible things to my mother. So when she became too ill to look after herself, and I went there to look after her, that was like a living amend to my mother. Yeah. And towards the end of her life, we enjoyed the closest relationship we ever had. Yeah.
Something
It
that I
was,
noticed as I was going through steps 4 and 5, and particularly with my mother, and she suffered from mental illness, and she was also she wasn't a supportive, loving mother. Okay, she could be, and times she was unpredictable. But
Yeah.
what I found when I started taking a look at myself through the inventory process, I was actually able to see that, well, if I, I was able to see my mother and me, and me and my mother. I was able to see that she was doing the best that she could, that whatever she experienced in her life brought her to the place where she was. And for
That's so
me,
true.
yeah, for me, it kind of gave me an understanding, I guess. It helped me with my resentment against her, so
Yeah,
those resentments fell away because I was able to see that, she had a mentally ill father,
absolutely.
and she grew up poor, and she took a lot of abuse as when she was growing up, much more than I did. So, and that, and it's just one of those things that, you know, the cycle stops with me. You
Thank you.
know,
Thank you. In fact, I had a profound experience when I was working with Jamie, when he was sponsoring me. I was in the middle of my fifth step, and I said, I said, Jamie, when I began to realize how distorted my perception of my history had been, and how I was only able to focus on the harms that others had done me, yeah, I said to Jamie, Jamie, how did I ever get so screwed up and distorted in my thinking? Yeah. And Jamie said to me, Andy, years of practice, my friend. Do you know what I mean? Which I thought was really funny. And then he says, what you've got to remember, Andy, is that as an alcoholic, you have always done the very best you could with the information available to you at the time. Yeah.
that's right.
So if that was true for me, yeah, it was true for my mother, it
Sure.
was true for my foster mother, and it was true for all the other people that abused me. They were
Yeah,
acting out their own wounds on me,
that's right.
yeah,
That's right.
subconsciously, yeah.
That's right.
My foster mother went through the Warsaw Uprising during the Second World War and had to work in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw and saw daily atrocities to the Jewish people, yeah, by the Germans when she was taking provisions into the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. Yeah, she was traumatized by that. She was
Absolutely.
clearly traumatized by that. Yeah. Um, my mother had the most horrendous childhood. Yeah, in Poland. Yeah. Um, I'm not going to go into the
Yeah,
details, but
I
she was
understand.
a very psychologically wounded person, and she was just acting out subconsciously her own wounds
Absolutely.
on me. Yeah,
That this trauma
yeah.
goes the
So
trauma is passed down from generation to generation.
indeed,
Uh,
indeed. So in my book, I say that this is it's not for nothing that they call alcoholism the family disease. It's a cross generational disease. It goes from generation to generation, and I come from a particularly dysfunctional family, yeah, in Poland, going back at least 6 generations. Very, very unwell people, if you like, yeah. I was an alcoholic waiting to happen by the
Right.
time I was
Yeah.
13 years old. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was my story. I've got no resentments, total forgiveness, yeah, a total understanding, and in many ways, my experiences of early life, I've been able to reframe them and see them in a way as a gift because it's helped me to access more compassion for
Yeah.
other people suffering. Yeah. Because I've been there and I've worn the T-shirt, and I'd like to believe that when someone comes to me and asks for sponsorship, and they're in a lot of pain, yeah, I'm able to really empathize with that pain, yeah,
So how'd you
and
get to
extend a hand of compassion.
so how'd you finally get to Thailand?
Um, this is also interesting. My mother never made a formal amend to me for the
Uh-huh.
harms that she done me, yeah. But what she did do was buy me a flat in Thailand. she actually bought me a condominium in Thailand. That was her amends
Oh.
to me. Yeah.
Oh.
And
Okay.
said, yeah, yeah. She bought me a condo in Thailand, and she said, "Don't stay in England. It's a lost cause. In England is gone to the dogs. Yeah,
Okay.
there's no future there for you. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And go and live in Thailand. Yeah." And so I retired early from my profession. I worked in social care as a community support worker, doing floating support with the elderly. Yeah.
Hmm.
So I retired early and I came to live in Thailand, and that's where I met my partner. We've been together for 5 years. Yeah.
Nice.
And have a good life in Thailand. I'm retired now and have a really wonderful life in Thailand. We
Great.
have 6 AA meetings here a week. Yeah. In the town that I live. You're very welcome to come and visit, John, if you're ever in Thailand. Yeah,
Someday
and
they will
I've
let
got a life
Americans
beyond.
travel. Someday they'll let Americans
Not for
travel
today.
again, and not now they won't.
Not for today. Not for today. The
Yeah.
borders are still firmly closed. Yeah. So that's it really.
So what got you
Um,
interested in
I
writing the book? The book. What got
well,
you
that's
interested in
another
writing the book?
interesting. I was seeing an awful lot. I almost died. I almost died, John, as a result of not being able to do the steps because I couldn't get my head around the God word or a higher power. It was literally death for me. Yeah. Um, and I know that there's a lot of people in the fellowship in London. I cannot talk about America
Sure.
or any other country, but there's a lot of people in the fellowship in London that either leave AA because of the God word or don't even bother coming to AA in the first place because they see AA as some kind of quasi religion.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they don't even bother coming. And my belief is that there's a lot of alcoholics dying, drinking themselves to death because they can't get to grips with any concept of a higher power. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, I owe it to myself and to these people to share my experiences that you don't need to believe in God for the steps to work for you. Yeah.
Right.
Uh, you do need higher powers, practical higher powers, AA itself, the suggestions of a sponsor, the steps themselves. Um, Even writing daily gratitude lists was a power greater than me because it
Hmm.
helped to resolve my self-pity trips, which I used to suffer from. Yeah. So there are a lot of very practical higher powers available in AA that are not divine in nature,
Right.
if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, yeah, I was looking in your website, which has some great information about what you're planning on doing with the book, and it looks really interesting. You know, the things that you're going to write about. You know, your journey through the steps. About You're going to write about sponsorship. You're going to talk about helping people get through the God bit in AA, and also about relapse. And
Yeah.
that's I think a good thing to write about. Actually, that's what are your thoughts about relapse?
I think that it's a part of the disease of alcoholism.
Yeah,
For some people, it's part of their journey,
it is.
uh, and and it's been a very important part of my journey. Relapse has got me to David B. Yeah,
Right,
and
right.
although he's not the type of sponsor that I would have chosen under normal circumstances, uh, relapse got me to David B. And in his own strange way, David B. probably saved my life. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, there's a lovely piece. There's a lovely piece in As Bill Sees It by Bill, where he says that sometimes relapse is not necessarily a bad thing. For many alcoholics, it can be seen as a kick upstairs and not
that's right. Yeah,
downstairs.
I remember that
Yeah.
reading. Yep, that's right.
And I
It's a
thought to myself, that's exactly what my real. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Sorry.
I don't, yeah, it's like you don't forget what you may have learned in the past. You may actually learn something from that, But it's like anything that you've been able to build during that time before the relapse, you still have. And the relapse can just make you stronger by learning from, even more from that experience and sharing it with other people.
Well, I think that the greatest gift that I got from all my relapses was, and I think that I also had some denial here for a long time, is that I didn't really believe that I was powerless over alcohol and drugs. Deep down, I
Yeah.
didn't really believe it. And I also didn't believe that those relapses and the amount of chaos that I created as an untreated alcoholic, all my relapses convinced me beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was absolutely powerless over alcohol and other substances, and that left to my own devices, I was incapable of managing my own life. Therefore, I had to come under new management, and David
Right.
B happened to be my new manager. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I
So,
really
so
like
it
your
was a gift.
website. I like your website. When I was actually first coming to terms with being an atheist in AA, one thing that I did that helped me through that was write. And so I started a website for my home group, and there was a blog on that website. And so I would write, much like what you're doing, about my understanding of my experience in AA as a non-believer and how I choose to interpret that experience and explain it. And I'm similar to you. I came up in a group that was very much into the big book and had a very regimented way of going through that book. And I participated in that group for 25 years before I realized to myself I was an atheist. And but as I looked at the big book, I didn't really have a problem. When I read that, I could see that everything that was in there was pretty practical. And if I just crossed out the God stuff, all the practical action was still left in there. So for me, I was quite comfortable with that process. But it was really
Absolutely.
hard to explain that to the people who were deeply devoted to the God idea. uh
Absolutely.
so it's
Absolutely.
great to have this access to people who have a similar belief system like you and I. And because it does help a lot of people to find a website like yours and to see that, oh yeah, I don't have to worry about all that God stuff. There are many different ways to view a higher power, as you've mentioned. So I look forward to reading your book when you have it all done.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
It's quite a
Can
quite
I
a
just say
project, I'm
what?
sure.
Say again.
It's quite a project, I'm sure.
No, no, I'm enjoying the journey. I'm enjoying the
Yeah,
journey.
yeah.
There's one other thing that I would like to say
Okay.
is that I certainly had problems other than alcohol when I
Hmm.
came in. Yeah, uh, I got two diagnoses from professional healthcare people. The first diagnosis was borderline personality disorder. Yeah,
Hmm.
and the second diagnosis was complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. And all I can tell you is that my work on the steps as a non-believer, as an agnostic, has helped to resolve those issues.
That's great.
And that to me is a miracle. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, that's great. Well, and it's good of you to pass that on to others that are like you and me. So good work. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and look forward to following your blog as you complete it. And the article that you wrote, we'll be posting that along with the podcast when that comes out, which won't be too far from now, I'm sure. So,
Thank you very much for that, John.
so very
Thank
nice to
you.
meet you. So I'm going to go ahead and play us on out. And that's it. That's another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. So, if you would like to help out our website and podcast, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. We're starting to get involved with Patreon again. So you can go on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/AA Beyond Belief, and you can sign up for different tiers, like donate $1 a month, $5 a month, whatever, and you can get some special little perks. And the same thing on YouTube. and I'm going to be good about delivering those perks. And if you don't want any of that, you don't want to do monthly contributions, you can go over to our website and just click on the donate button. But if you don't have the money, that's okay too. We will make it anyway. Again, Andy, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, John. It was a pleasure for me too.
Absolutely.